Our very first speaker is Libby, and Libby, I've had the pleasure of working with her through our First Connections program, and she has spoken with many AML and bone marrow transplant patients over the years, quite a few years, and she's about providing hope and perspective for people, and she actually has spoken with one or two people in the room today. Dr. Libby Goszer is a clinical psychologist who recently celebrated her 10th anniversary of an unrelated stem cell transplant in Vancouver. She has shared aspects of blood cancer stories in Vancouver as an honored hero at our Light the Night walk and at our Journey of Hope. She has also spoken in Toronto and Winnipeg at fundraising events for Israel's bone marrow donor registry, the registry that provides her with a life-saving match. Libby has attended donor drives for Canadian Blood Services and written for Canadian Stem Cell Club. I am so pleased for her to be here today and to share her experience with AML.
Good morning. So I stand here today really as an example of why research and clinical trials are so very important to the survival and quality of life of blood cancer patients. You've heard that professionally I am a clinical psychologist, but today I'm not speaking to you as a psychologist. I'm speaking to you as a blood cancer survivor. My personal journey with blood cancer began in June of 2007, only 3 weeks after the onset of painful back spasms, neck pain, and increasingly severe headaches. I was stunned to be diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, an aggressive form of leukemia that required my immediate hospitalization. Oh, that moment of diagnosis. To say that it was a life-changing experience, as many of you know, is an understatement. For me, it was like being transported into a terrifying and isolating parallel universe. One moment, I was a competent professional, devoted mother, wife, and friend. The next moment, I was a blood cancer patient facing intensive chemotherapy treatment that would keep me in a hospital isolation room for most of the next 4 months. I was stunned, uncomfortable, and very scared. The future was uncertain, and I was terrified of dying. While chemotherapy did put my leukemia into remission, this joyful news was tempered by the fact that I was told there was a 60% chance that my leukemia would return. And just 10 months later, it did. My only hope for survival was a stem cell transplant. Without siblings of my own, I was so fortunate to have an anonymous donor who was described as a perfect match for me. More intensive chemo and radiation were needed to prepare me for the transplant, which occurred on November 27th, 2008. That's almost 11 years ago. Let's see if this works. That's me celebrating my 10th anniversary of my stem cell transplant, or as I like to call it, my rebirthday. I get 2 birthdays a year. When I look back on the last 12 years now, I remember the physical and emotional trauma associated with facing a life-threatening illness. While the treatments were often painful, I still get emotional at this, the single most challenging part of my cancer journey was the possibility that I might die and leave my young son motherless. You see, my son Micah had just turned 11 years old when I first became ill. While I had moments where I came to accept the possibility that I might die, I really could never fathom having to abandon my child and my husband. So from my hospital bed, when I had the energy, I would write my son love notes that my husband would put in his lunch bag or on his bed at night to try and lessen the impact of my prolonged absences. Of course, it was also very hard to watch my husband struggling to visit me both before and after work while also parenting our child. I'd like to show you a picture. This is my son and me on our first Mother's Day after I had been ill. And I think you can see on the look on his face, you get a sense of the trauma that our family had endured for the previous 10 months. Some days during and between treatments were impossibly difficult, and I relied on a variety of influences to soothe myself and engender hope, including some amazing doctors and nurses, meditation and healing rituals, counseling, Inspire Health's supportive cancer care program, the First Connection program from LLS, and of course, a small network of select family and friends. I would like to highlight just a few of these influences with you, beginning with a profound experience that I had on my very first evening of hospitalization. Only 48 hours after being diagnosed with leukemia, I was isolated in a hospital room, in shock and struggling as I awaited treatment for a devastating illness and tried to cope with an uncertain future. Fortunately for me, that same evening, I was visited by a highly empathic physician. Dr. Linda Vickers knelt down by my bed so that we were at each other's eye level. She held my hand and she said to me, "Have hope that you can beat this disease." Words that I would return to repeatedly over the next 2 years of treatment. Still today, I am grateful that this physician willingly, just for a moment, went beyond the usual limits of statistical probabilities and concern about informed consent to offer me what I needed most, which was hope. I want to clarify that while Dr. Vickers' words inspired hope and allowed me to even see the possibility of a future, my path from a blood cancer patient in treatment to now a longer-term survivor has been filled with obstacles and some rather deep pitfalls. Despite generally holding a hopeful outlook, I still have experienced moments of doubt, fear, and pessimism. At least for me, and I suspect it's true for most people, it wasn't possible to maintain a hopeful attitude at all times. In fact, to put pressure on yourself to continually be optimistic, it is, in my opinion, neither necessary nor useful. One period of time where my feelings of hopelessness were particularly intense was during my first 10-month remission. While everyone around me seemed to be celebrating the fact that I had achieved a remission, all I could focus on was the knowledge that the return of my leukemia was more probable than not. Even though I knew I had an available stem cell donor, should my leukemia return, I still felt that the odds were stacked against me, and that either I wouldn't receive get a second remission that I would need for a transplant, or survive the transplant itself. This is when I turned to the patient support services of our very own Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. What a gift that was. Courtesy of their First Connection program, I was put in touch with a gentleman from Oregon who had a similar diagnosis to mine, had achieved a first remission, then a recurrence of leukemia about a year later, and then a successful unrelated stem cell transplant. My conversations with Rick from Oregon allowed me to find empathy, validation, and shared wisdom with someone whose story was similar to mine. More importantly, the very fact that there was at least one human being in this world that had survived gave me just enough hope and confidence so that when my leukemia did return, I didn't completely panic. I was able to re-enter hospital and prepare for my transplant with the idea that it was the next important step in my hoped for long-term survival. Throughout my journey with cancer, I also relied heavily on a fantastic network of friends and family who provided emotional or instrumental support or simple companionship. There's nothing quite like the friend or family member who can tolerate your vulnerability when you are fragile, who can hold hope for you when you cannot, who will feed your child, bring you cut up pieces of fruit when that's all you can imagine eating, and who will sit with you hours on end, chatting away, not minding if you don't respond, because they know that you just need somebody to be there. Amid the trials and tribulations of being a cancer patient, there were also happy, even joyful moments that emerged. For example, I remember the day of my stem cell transplant vividly. I was in my hospital bed, surrounded by good friends and my husband. A woman walked into my room carrying a small case with a bag of stem cells. We knew she'd come from the airport, but we had no idea from which city or country. Rather than being afraid, I just found myself being very curious as to where she might have come from. The procedure itself was quite simple, similar to having a blood transfusion, except this time it was stem cells. I really felt at peace. And then I had this very unusual experience. It's called hunger, which was a rare thing for me in those days. And to everyone's amazement, I requested and devoured an entire slice of pizza. It was a really happy day. And of course, I can't do justice to my story of survival without at least telling you about my once anonymous donor, a young man from Israel named Moshe. I learned of his identity in 2012, about 4 years after the transplant. With the help of translators, we corresponded by email, and I learned that he is a compassionate human being who believes, as he puts it, that giving to others is one of the most important things in life. In the summer of 2013, my family and I traveled to Israel, where we had the privilege of meeting Moshe, his parents, his then girlfriend, other members of his family. This is a picture of Moshe on the right, me, his then girlfriend Yael, and my son Micah. And this is a picture of the Moshe and members of his family, notably his parents. When we met the Maram family, I think they were as excited to meet us as we were to meet them. They treated us like celebrities. It was a really amazing experience. It was a privilege to be able to thank Moshe in person for helping save my life. And it was just amazing to watch my son thank him for saving his mother's life. Moshe and Yael have since married. They now have a beautiful little boy and a baby daughter. From the darkness of a life-threatening illness has emerged a new set of precious relationships between Moshe and me and between his family and my own. There really is no category in the English language that aptly captures the unique relationship between a stem cell donor and their recipient. We're not exactly family, but we are so much more than friends. We stay in touch because we are now forever connected. My cherished relationship with my stem cell donor continues to be a valued legacy of blood cancer survivorship. But I think, as many of you know, life after cancer can be complicated. With the benefit now of nearly 11 years since my transplant, I see being a survivor as a developmental process that, like any growth, changes or matures with time. In the early days, when my treatment was finished, I was happy to be at home, but honestly, my worries and fears, especially the fear that cancer would return, were really intense. I tried to focus on the present to help me get through each day, but it really wasn't enough. Any consideration of the future, even the short-term future, wasn't only uncomfortable, it actually felt dangerous. It's difficult to explain, but maybe some of you can relate. It was like a superstition, and I had developed this false belief that if I dared assume that I would be alive in the future, then cancer would return and snatch that future away from me. I can remember when my husband tried to lift my spirits by suggesting that we plan a summer getaway. And rather than acknowledge his gesture as a loving one, I responded angrily and impatiently, "No!" He had inadvertently triggered my terror. Or another time when he gently said, "Would you like to come to the grocery store with me?" trying to get me out of the house. Well, I was just horrified at that thought. I couldn't face the outside world. In part, it was because I was afraid of germs, but I had no hair, I had no eyebrows, I had moon face from prednisone, and it had deeply affected my self-esteem and my confidence. Looking back, I realized that in some ways I had temporarily lost my identity. Fortunately, with the passage of time, the intensity of the fears that had a grip on me gradually began to diminish. Time can be such a great healer. Where once all my thoughts appeared to be bound up with cancer, I began to have longer and longer periods of time where I could focus on other things. While having had leukemia will always be a part of the scenery of my life, it is no longer the entire backdrop. As time went by, I began to understand that life would not be returning to normal, and that I would have to sculpt and welcome a new normal and perhaps even a new me in some ways. Physically, the road to recovery post-transplant has always had its challenges. It's a bit like being on a roller coaster, and an unpredictable one at that. There are good days and less good days. I don't have the stamina to engage in a regular work schedule, but I can work just enough to keep me intellectually stimulated. I do have some mobility issues and a wonky immune system, but boy, I am still able to embrace the important pleasures of living, like occasional travel, taking my dog Sadie for beachside walks. Yes, she's cute. Sipping a good cup of coffee and watching my now 23-year-old son mature into a warm, genuine, and loving young man. While I can't say that I understand all the ways that having had leukemia has impacted me, I do know that I'm better at focusing on the present rather than worrying about an uncertain future or a difficult past. I have learned to transform moments of fearfulness into reminders to be thankful for the blessings that already exist in my life. I no longer live in a state of worry, and I am truly grateful to be alive. Yet, I do want you to know that the experience of cancer can be a traumatic one. And for me, its imprint still lingers. Yes, even today, in response to certain events, I can find myself suddenly worried that leukemia has returned. A trigger can include an unexpected phone call in close proximity to a blood test, a follow-up visit with a physician, especially in the hospital setting, or if I have, physical symptoms that I don't recognize or seem to be going on too long, I can worry. However, I have learned to be especially kind to myself when old worries reemerge, having empathy for the part of me that was once traumatized by an unexpected cancer diagnosis and thrust into a terrifying parallel universe serves to calm me and help me regain control of my emotions. My life is a fulfilling one. In some ways, I have even found a new level of value to life itself. My desire to give back is strong and adds to making my life meaningful. I volunteer with LLS, speaking at events periodically like I am now. I do offer short-term support through the First Connection program that was once so meaningful to me. And as you heard before, I do attend donor drives, sometimes with my son, where we encourage people in the community to get registered on the stem cell and bone marrow registry. While each of our journeys with cancer is of course unique, I hope that my story of survival has offered you some knowledge and inspiration. Thank you.